Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the world to the Enlightenment Podcast. It's a critical time in the world. We feel that it's important to have a dialogue, particularly about Palestine, offering some context that we feel is sometimes missing from mainstream media, and to highlight Palestine's rich traditions, culture, and history. Today, we are absolutely thrilled to be able to discuss Arab Jews and Zionism and Palestine and a host of other things with our very special guest, Professor Avi Shlaim. Professor Avi Shlaim, welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. I'll give you a little bit of background. Professor Shlaim is an Israeli and British historian of Iraqi Jewish descent. He's one of the Israeli New Historians. That's a group of Israeli scholars who put forward critical interpretations of the history of Zionism and of Israel. Professor Shlaim is an Emeritus Professor of International Relations at Oxford University, and he's the author of many brilliant books, including Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, which I understand has just been published in Arabic as well. So we'll be putting up pictures and links to the books for you.
And ahlan and welcome. Shamim and I are very happy, as Shamim said, to have you on our podcast. You're our first Israeli guest, Professor Avi. You're an Arab Jew from Iraq. And for millennia, Arab Jews lived across the Arab and Muslim world, including Turkey and Iran. And they've often prospered, as you mentioned in your book, lived peacefully and considered themselves as Arabs, while European Jews were being discriminated against in the West. But this all started to change in the Arab and Muslim world as a result of Zionism and the establishment of Israel. So could you please tell us about you, your family, as not many people seem to know about Arab Jews?
Indeed. And my family and I was born in Baghdad to a Jewish family, and we were Iraqi Jews. We were Iraqi first and Jewish second. And the Jewish community in Iraq had deep roots in the country, roots going back to the Babylonian exile 2.5 millennia ago. And there were many thriving Jewish communities in the Arab world before the emergence of the State of Israel in 1948. There were Jewish communities in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, throughout North Africa, throughout the Maghreb. But the Jewish community in Iraq was the most ancient, the most distinguished, the most prosperous, and also the best integrated into Iraqi society. So my family and I were Arab Jews. For us, Muslim-Jewish coexistence was not a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. It's something that we touched. We only spoke Arabic at home. Social customs were Arab customs. Our food was delicious Middle Eastern food. My parents' music was a nice blend of Jewish and Arabic music. We were very happy in Iraq. And in Iraq, the Jews did not stand out. They were not the other. In Iraq, Europe had a Jewish problem. In Europe, the Jews were the main other, and they were symbolic of the other. Iraq didn't have a Jewish problem. Iraq had a lot of minorities, many different minorities, including Jews. So we are one minority among many, and there was a long tradition of religious tolerance and coexistence between the minorities. What changed everything is the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Zionism gave the Jews a territorial dimension for the first time in 2 millennia. There was now a Jewish state, and any Arab who didn't like Jews could now say to the Jews, you don't belong here, you're aliens, you're foreigners, why don't you go and join your brothers in the Jewish state? So this was the big change, and the Jews from the Arab world, by and large, were not very interested in Zionism. Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews. My family didn't have the slightest affinity with Zionism. My mother used to always talk about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. So after the establishment of the State of Israel, there was a massive migration of Arab Jews from the entire Arab world to Israel. But in the case of my family and me, and the majority of Iraqi Jews, it was not a voluntary move, uprooting, and it's not a voluntary move, but it was a move to Israel that was forced on us by circumstances beyond our control.
Can we talk about that? Because, as you know, I'm a novelist and a filmmaker, so, stories are extremely important to me. But in your book, you touched on what you've just said there, the book Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. There was a story in there that I felt was worthy of one of our big Hollywood thrillers, because you share this story of how 100 or more than 100,000 Iraqi Jews did move to Israel eventually between 1950 and 1951 because of terror bombings. But I was stunned to find out who was behind those terror bombings. Can you tell us a little bit about your findings and the role of Mossad in this?
Yes. In 1950 and 51, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish premises in Baghdad, and that accelerated the exodus of the Jews to Israel. In 1950, there were 135,000 Iraqi Jews. 2 years later, there were only about 10,000 left, and 125,000 Jews ended up in Israel. And there were always rumors when I was a boy that the Mossad had a hand in the bombs. And there was never any evidence, and Israel, of course, denied any involvement in the bombs. This question really interested me since I was a boy. And when I grew up and I was a historian, I worked in the state archives, the Israel State Archives, and one day I ordered the file on Iraq 1950, and it was closed. And that aroused my suspicion, but still I had no evidence. So I suspended judgment. But when I was working on my memoirs, I was staying with my mother in Ramat Gan, a town near Tel Aviv, and I met a friend of hers, an elderly friend of hers, Yaakov Karkukli, who was a member of the Zionist underground in Baghdad. And he told me in great detail about their activities in encouraging first illegal Jewish migration to Israel, and then later legal migration. They used to pay bribes to officials to forge documents, but most importantly, they resorted to terrorist tactics. His colleague, Yosef Basri, was the one who planted 3 out of the 5 bombs. The other 2 were unrelated to the Jewish underground, but these 3 bombs were the work of the Jewish underground. And Yosef Basri's controller was an Israeli intelligence officer called Max Binet, and Max Binet orchestrated these bombings.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, I think that's very important for people to know, because there's a lot of lack of understanding of what happened and why so many Iraqi Jews and Arab Jews have come, including in Egypt and so on. But you mentioned all the Arab Jews who went to Israel when it was first established and onwards. What was it like for you, your family, and how were Arab Jews received in Israel?
Arab Jews were not well received in Israel. I have a distant relative, Yitzhak Bar Moshe. He was a writer, and he only wrote in Arabic when he was in Israel, and one of his books was called Al-Khuruj min al-Iraq, Departure or Exodus from Iraq. And there he says, we left Iraq as Jews and we arrived in Israel as Iraqis. So it wasn't a happy homecoming, but it was worse than that. The Jews who arrived in Israel at the airport, arrived finally at the promised land, were sprayed with DDT, with insecticide, as if they were animals. And you can imagine how humiliating this was for them. And then the new immigrants were placed in transit camps in Ma'abarot. And the conditions in the Ma'abarot were really dire. There were tents, there were shacks, the food was inadequate, and the sanitary conditions were very, very primitive. And this was not a temporary, not a very limited period. They stayed in transition in Ma'abarot for quite a long time. And the managers of the transit camps were all Ashkenazi Jews who had no idea about who these people were, their level of education, their achievements, their state, their wealth, their status in Iraqi society. They thought that they were refugees running from persecution by the Arabs, and that they should be grateful for everything that Israel was doing for them. So this was the Zionist master narrative, that there was anti-Semitism everywhere throughout the Arab and Muslim world, and it's anti-Semitism that drove the Jews out of the Arab world, and Israel nobly offered them a safe haven. And my book undermines and undercuts the Zionist master narrative, particularly by showing that the Mossad played a part in uprooting Iraqi Jews and bringing them to Israel.
Professor Avi, I mean, Hanan and I, the stories that we tell on film are often about challenging the perceptions of the world that we are grown up with. And as you say, this master narrative was there. It's ingrained. It's still ingrained in a lot of mass media. I'm fascinated by your personal journey. So because you moved to Israel, you served in the Israeli army, I understand, and then became a new historian and an activist to some degree, an advocate against Zionism. What were the experiences? You've touched on a few of them, but for yourself personally, were there any particular moments or experiences that influenced that journey or changed your perception?
It was a long journey, and there wasn't a sudden conversion from Zionism to anti-Zionism. it was a very gradual process. So I went to school in Israel, and I was indoctrinated with the Zionist narrative. The history that we were taught at school was all European Jewish history, with an emphasis on the Holocaust. They never taught us anything about the rich history of the Jews in the Arab lands. And in my book, I tried to assert my right to narrate our own history as I understand it, rather than the Eurocentric Ashkenazi version of our history. And I served in the IDF in the mid-1960s, and I served loyally and proudly because I was indoctrinated, because I had total confidence that justice was on our side. I saw Israel as a small, peace-loving country surrounded by hostile Arabs determined to throw the Jews into the sea, and we had no choice but to stand up and fight. So that was my worldview when I was 18, 19. When the June 1967 war broke out, I was a first-year history student at Cambridge. And my change of attitude towards Israel began then, because the war changed everything. Israel trebled its territory. Israel became a fully fledged colonial power. And the IDF, my army, was transformed from a regular army into the brutal police force of a brutal colonial power. Secondly, after June 1967, Israel started building civilian settlements on occupied Palestinian land, which is illegal, of course. So Israel's behavior and the move towards Zionist colonialism beyond Israel's original borders was a major factor in my shift. But there was another much more important factor, and that is, as a historian, my main research interest was the Arab-Israeli conflict. I spent a whole year in the Israeli state archives, and I was radicalized in the archives because the evidence that I saw in the documents of the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry, the evidence that I saw in the archives didn't support the Zionist narrative about Israel being a peace-loving state. So I was radicalized in the archives.
And actually, those archives were in Hebrew, and not many people had access to them. And I think, as Shamim mentioned, you became one of Israel's new historians who refuted the Zionist myths, and also with all these declassified documents. But could you talk about what this means? Because why does this narrative still remain criticized and marginalized in Israeli society? With in the West, people just don't know much about it and don't look at it positively, if you like.
The new history emerged in Israel in the late 1980s, and the three original new historians were Benny Morris, Ilan Pape, and myself. All three of us are Israeli. All three of us know Hebrew. All three of us really benefited from the free access to the Israeli archives. And our work is based on primary sources, on archival research. Benny Morris wrote a book on the origins of the Palestinian refugee problem, and he demonstrated conclusively that the Palestinians didn't leave of their own free will, that they were pushed out. Ilan Pappé demonstrated that towards the end of the Jewish mandate in Palestine, Britain's aim was not to abort the birth of a Jewish state, but to abort the birth of a Palestinian state. In my book, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement and the Partition of Palestine, in that book, I showed that King Abdullah of Transjordan and the Jewish Agency by 1947 had reached a tacit agreement to divide Palestine between themselves at the expense of the Palestinians, and that after the guns fell silent, it was more Israeli intransigence than Arab intransigence that frustrated the quest for a political settlement. So the new history amounted to a frontal attack on all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war. And for a while, some of the findings of the new history infiltrated into the intellectual mainstream. But after the Second Intifada, there was a return in Israel to fundamentalist positions of us and them. And since then, the new history has declined in relevance, has been marginalized, as you said. But in a long historical perspective, it is very significant. And it was Edward Said who once said that the new history was important at three levels. First, it educated the Israeli public about the history of the conflict and about the Arab view of that history. Secondly, it gave the Palestinians and the Arabs an honest version of history which was in line with their own experience in 1948, rather than the usual propaganda of the victors. And thirdly, the new history encouraged a climate of opinion which was conducive to mutual recognition and reconciliation, and that helped to pave the way to the Oslo Accord. But Oslo turned out to be a huge disappointment, and it's been downhill ever since. And with the deterioration in Israeli-Palestinian relations, the new history became more and more marginalized.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, my mother's family, my family is Christian Palestinian, and my mom was from West Jerusalem, born in Haifa, where they had a home. And she also, in the Nakba in 48, they were forced to leave. And my dad's side is from Bethlehem. And like all the indigenous people from Palestine, they've been living there for millennia. And I think I would love you to touch on the Zionist claim that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land, and Sumud, Palestinian resilience, if you like, because what you've written about refutes that as well.
So a land without a people for a people without a land was an incredibly clever Zionist slogan. But it happened to be totally untrue, because there was a well-constituted Palestinian society in Palestine. So it wasn't a land without a people. There was a people, and from the beginning, this was a central dilemma of Zionism, that the land of their aspirations was already occupied, owned by another people. So to achieve the aim of Zionism, a Jewish state, the natives had to be removed. And there is an anecdote that illustrates this truth about the dilemma of Zionism. The story is about Theodor Herzl, the visionary of the Jewish state. He was a Hungarian Jew, a journalist and a playwright, and he wrote a pamphlet on the Jewish state. And his this is a very new idea and a very controversial idea. The rabbis of Vienna gathered together, they gathered some money, and they sent two of their members to Palestine on a fact-finding mission. And the two rabbis sent a telegram from Palestine, which became famous, and it said, the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man.
I didn't hear that before. Interesting.
And I would add to that the logic that Zionism is a settler colonial movement and Israel is a settler colonial state. And the logic of settler colonialism is not compromise, not coexistence, but the elimination of the natives, ethnic cleansing, in other words. And this is what Israel, the Zionist movement, has been doing ever since 1917, ever since the Balfour Declaration. Noam Chomsky once said that settler colonialism is the most settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. Since 1917, the Palestinians have been at the receiving end of Zionist settler colonialism on the one hand, and Western imperialism, first under Britain and then under America, until today. And in Gaza, this combination of Zionist settler colonialism with the support of Western imperialism has reached a new climax, a new peak.
Yeah, no, it's horrific. And I wanted to ask you about that, but about this whole going back to this idea of this partition of Palestine, which happened with a UN vote in 1946, I think, but without the consent of the Palestinians, or the neighboring Palestinian countries. And those 33 countries that formed the UN at that time, primarily imperialist Western countries, gave away 56% of Palestine. But then in 1948, the newly formed Israeli regime took over 78% of historic Palestine, not 56%, which of course led to, the displacement and ethnic cleansing, as you mentioned, of even more Palestinians, over 750,000. My question, very long-windedly, is a year later, when Israel got admitted into the UN, there were specific conditions, I understand, to which they had to agree, which was that all Palestinian refugees would be given the right to return. There would be equal rights to citizens within 1948 Palestine, and that Jerusalem would remain this corpus separatum, if you will. Those conditions have not been met. And why has there been no accountability in 77 years, in your opinion? And how could there be accountability?
Let's start with the UN Partition Resolution of 1947. It was profoundly unfair to the Palestinians because the Jews were a minority, and yet the plan accorded to them 55 or 56% of mandatory Palestine. And at that time, the Jews owned only 7% of the land. And as you said, in the course of the war, Israel expanded its borders to 78% of mandatory Palestine. And in 1949, Israel signed armistice agreements with all the neighboring Arab states. These are the only internationally recognized borders that Israel has ever had. These are the only borders that I recognize as legitimate. Everything else, everything that Israel captured in June 1967 is the Zionist colonial project beyond the Green Line, beyond the armistice lines. And in 1949, Israel was admitted to the United Nations under certain conditions, and Israel did not fulfill any of these conditions. But most important is the Palestinian right of return, because after a war, after the ending of hostilities, the civilians are allowed to return to their home. That's the pattern. But this was not the case with Israel and the Palestinians. And the UN passed in December 1948 Resolution 194, which says any refugees who want to return to their homes should be given a choice whether to receive compensation or to return to their homes in Palestine. And it's important that it's not Israel, but the refugees who had the right to choose between compensation or to return to their homes. And there were not a few, but 750,000 Palestinian refugees. But Israel stubbornly refused either to pay compensation or to allow the right of return. So Israel's position after 1948 was that the Palestinians have the right to no return. It's not paid a penny in compensation, and it's rejected the right of return of the Palestinians.
And as you mentioned, Professor Avi, that this illegal theft of 1948 continues to be excluded from any peace talks or negotiations, and they keep omitting it and talking about the 67 border. Is this even legal, or is this moral? I know it's not, but is it even legal, do you think?
There is a difference between 1948 and 1967, between the 1948 file and the 1967 file. And the Oslo Accord only addressed the 1967 file, what to do with the territories that Israel captured, Palestinian territories that Israel captured in 1967. It did not touch 1948 or the right of return of the 1948ers. This was Edward Said's main critique of the Oslo Accord, that it addressed the Israeli territorial expansion in 1948, but it did not address the roots of the problem, which is the Nakba, which is the refugee problem.
I wanted to ask you about apartheid, Professor Avi, because there are a large number of Palestinians who remained in what is now Israel during that time. Palestinians of 48 who now referred to in Israel as Israeli Arabs, which I know Hanan and I feel is very much an attempt to erase Palestinian identity and culture. But could you elaborate on whether or not you see apartheid against Palestinians who live within Israel, because that is a crime against humanity under international law. My parents are from South Africa, so I understand in some detail the differences that can apply just from being able to live in certain places, needing passes in certain places.
But that's in the West Bank also, and East Jerusalem, Gaza, not only in Israel. Yeah.
Yep.
Israel always prided itself on being a Jewish and democratic. In reality, it's a democracy for Jews and a Jewish state for the Palestinians. Let's look at the Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel first. They have the vote. So formally, they have equal political rights, but there is discrimination against them at every level. So they are not equal citizens. And if you want proof of that, that they are second-class citizens, look at the nation-state law of July 2018, which says Jews have a unique right to self-determination in the state of Israel. In other words, there are two categories of citizens, and Palestinians are second-class citizens. And Israel is the only member of the United Nations that I know which is officially racist, and the proof is this law. But the present government, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, is more extreme than that, because the policy guidelines of this government say that Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination in the whole land of Israel. So now the claim to sovereignty has extended from Israel proper to the whole land of Israel, which includes the West Bank. That's part of the problem. And now let's look at the position of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. They never had any political rights. There are two different judicial systems. There is civil law governing the settlers on the West Bank, and military government, military government, which applies to the Palestinians. Two different judicial systems, as in South Africa. So that's apartheid. And Israel denies that it is an apartheid state. But in the last 3 years, 4 major human rights groups have issued detailed reports which prove that Israel is an apartheid state. And the most important one is B'Tselem, the highly respected Israeli human rights group, which issued a report which said that from the river to the sea, there is one regime, and it's an apartheid regime and a Jewish supremacist regime. Before this report, B'Tselem used to focus on Israeli human rights violations in the occupied territories. But in this report, there is a change. It said the whole area between the river and the sea is one unit, and you can't distinguish between the occupied territories and Israel proper anymore. It's all governed by Israel. It's all dominated by Israel. And it's not a democracy. It's an ethnocracy. It's a system in which one ethnic group dominates the other.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's become. Sorry, Shamim, did I interrupt?
No, not at all.
Yeah, and then also if we can talk about Gaza, which was under siege for 17 years. It was attacked repeatedly over the years, and really it has exposed the hypocrisy of Western values. And it seems like people in the north, in sort of the global north, are witnessing not only a live stream genocide for the first time, but many people, including Jewish people in the West, started to actually really find out more and more about the actual history of Palestinians. Could you please talk about Gaza and the current situation, the historical continuity of terror and its impact on the Palestinian communities?
I've just finished writing a book, or rather a collection of essays, which will be published next month under the heading Genocide in Gaza, Israel's Long War on Palestine. So it's a vast subject, and as we have limited time, I just want to highlight some of the important points about Gaza, which are not well known in the West. The history of Gaza is not at all well known. So a number of points. First is that Gaza is not poor and underdeveloped because of objective reasons. but because of a deliberate Israeli policy of de-development, of preventing Gaza from developing, from building industry. And the leading expert on that is Sarah Roy, and her book, The Gaza Strip, a study in development. So that's the first point. Secondly, Hamas won a fair and free election in January 2006, and there is no debate about that, and it proceeded to form a government, and it offered Israel negotiations on a long-term ceasefire, and Israel refused to negotiate. Israel resorted to economic warfare to undermine the Hamas government, and the European Union and the United States, to their eternal shame, refused to recognize the democratically elected Palestinian government and help Israel to undermine it. There was a plot against Hamas. Hamas seized power in Gaza in 2007, and Israel imposed a blockade. The blockade is a form of collective punishment, which is prescribed by international law. So Israel has been behaving illegally for the last 17 years before the Hamas attack of the 7th of October. And in this war, Israel has gone way beyond anything that it has done before. By my count, this is the 8th Israeli military assault on Gaza since the unilateral disengagement from Gaza in 2005. But because the fact that because Israel continued to control all access to Gaza after the disengagement, it is still under international law the occupying power. So Israel is the occupying power in Gaza with all the obligations of an occupying power. So this is the 8th military assault on Gaza, but it's hugely more destructive and more lethal than any of the previous 7 assaults. And make no mistake, this is not simply a war between Israel and Hamas. It's an attack by Israel on the civilian population of Gaza. It's an attack on the people of Gaza as a whole, with the aim of ethnic cleansing. And ethnic cleansing hasn't worked so far, that this was the aim, to depopulate Gaza. It hasn't worked so far, and Israel has moved beyond ethnic cleansing to genocide, and Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza.
So apart from the political, the decision to go to war, to bomb indiscriminately, I think it seems to me that a lot of the warfare is psychological, and it's through the media. It's representing Palestinians as terrorists. It's representing it sort of ignores the fact that there is settler colonialism going on. So there's a level of dehumanization, I think, because it's hard to imagine, this number of non-Palestinians being killed without some kind of uproar. That dehumanization, is there a way that it can change, you think, or Palestinians can be better represented as human, as people who deserve to be back in their land and in their country?
The Israeli narrative about the Palestinians and about Gaza is dominant in the West. And the Israeli narrative has always portrayed the Palestinian as terrorists. Although, as I said a minute ago, Hamas actually formed a political party and won a fair and free election. During this war, Israeli the Israeli army has been really, really brutal. But the mendacity of the Israeli spin doctors match the brutality of the Israeli soldiers. Israeli propaganda, misinformation is nothing new, but it has reached a new level during the war in Gaza. And I listened to Israeli military spokesmen very carefully, and it's very rare for them to say anything that is truthful. They keep lying. They lie after lie after lie all the time about the reality of the situation in Gaza. Israel doesn't allow journalists to go into Gaza, and the Israeli public is not informed about the real situation in Gaza. Also, there's been a huge increase in the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. The Israelis have started calling not just Hamas, but all Palestinian people as to denounce them as terrorists. There's been rhetoric which is difficult to believe, and a rhetoric about the Palestinians, comparing them to animals. And this rhetoric, this dehumanization, has happened at every level, from President Herzog down. Israel is engaged in genocide in Gaza. It's very rare for a country that is committing genocide to say that what their real intention, what their views are. But the rhetoric in Israel is really extreme. Galant, the Minister of Defense, said the Palestinians are human animals and will treat them as such. And the danger with dehumanization is that it paves the way to atrocities and to genocide. This is what Nazi Germany said about the Jews. They are dehumanized. And if your enemy is not human, that seems to lead justification to treating them as inhuman. It's a very, very dangerous situation.
Very much so, very much so. Because really, when we look back, Palestinians, whether Muslim, Christian, and Jews, coexisted for centuries in Palestine until the advent of Zionism into Palestine. I remember my grandfather always had Palestinian Jewish friends. They would be in each other's lives. So that there was no issue at that time prior to all the issues we talked about. I don't know what you feel, but I believe the only solution really is a single democratic state with equal rights for all people, regardless of skin color, religion, nationality, with justice, reparation, the right of return of all Palestinians, which is recognized under international law, as we talked about. But do you agree, or do you feel, and if you do agree, do you think it'll happen in our lifetime, or is there an alternative solution? Because now with the settlements, with everything that's going on, I'd love to know your thoughts on a solution and something maybe more hopeful, if at all.
Like you, I support a one-state solution. In the past, I supported a two-state solution when it seemed viable. And a two-state solution would have been far from absolute justice for the Palestinians. By signing the Oslo Accord, the PLO gave up its claim to 78% of historic Palestine, gave its claim to 4/5 of its homeland in return for what they thought would be an independent Palestinian state on the remaining 22%, on Gaza and the West Bank, with a capital city in East Jerusalem. But it was not to be. The Oslo Accords collapsed, and the present government in Israel is dead against the Palestinian state. They say this all the time. So Israel killed the two-state solution by annexing East Jerusalem, by building settlements, by expropriating Arab land, by building the so-called security barrier on the West Bank, which is unlawful. So Israel killed the two-state solution, and now it's impossible to conceive a viable, territorially contiguous Palestinian state. If you had a Palestinian state, it would be enclaves surrounded on the West Bank, surrounded by Israeli settlements and military bases. And therefore, today I advocate one state. It's the only democratic solution. One state for equal rights for all its citizens, from the river to the sea, regardless of ethnicity and religion. And I've been with my wife and daughter on pro-Palestinian marches in London, and we chanted from the river to the sea. What I mean by this is that in this area, all the citizens should have freedom and equal rights. Equality is important. Equality is an indispensable component of democracy. So what really matters now is equal rights. And there's been a shift in opinion from traditional notions of sovereignty, independence, and borders to emphasis on human rights. And the one-state solution has that merit of guaranteeing human rights and equality and freedom for all. You asked whether I think this is likely in our lifetime, and sadly, it's unlikely because of Israeli opposition. There is no support, or there's really, really marginal, a minuscule number of Israelis who support a one-state solution. So Israel as a state would be totally opposed and resist such a scenario, and therefore it's unlikely to be achieved in my lifetime at any rate. But this is the only democratic solution. This is the only just solution, and therefore I would continue to advocate this resolution, this kind of resolution of this century-long conflict.
I couldn't agree more. Personally, it sounds fair. It sounds like it speaks to everybody's need for justice. But when activists are thinking about, as you say, maybe a slightly longer timeline, but they still want to make a meaningful impact. They want to influence that future. What's your advice to activists who want to try to make a difference? Where should we all focus?
My advice to activists is never give up, never despair, never give up, continue the struggle. Defeat is a psychological phenomenon. You're not defeated until you admit defeat, and the Palestinians and their friends must not admit defeat. The Palestinians must continue with sumud, steadfastness, and the supporters around the world must step up the solidarity and actions in support of the Palestinians. So the hope for the future lies in activism. It lies in BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This is a grassroots global movement, and it's non-violent. It's non-violent. I emphasize, it's not a terrorist organization, as the Israelis claim. It's a non-violent organization, and all its principal goals are enshrined in international law. End of occupation, equal rights for the Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel and the right of return. And BDS has been gaining traction. It terrifies the Israeli government, which is why they spend such resources in trying to discredit it. So there is a disconnect between the Western publics and the Western governments. The Western governments have always been hypocritical, and they have never been more hypocritical than they have been during the war in Gaza. The American government and the British government are not just complicit in genocide in Gaza, they are active partners to Israel in committing genocide. So the only hope lies with civil society, with protests, with marches, with BDS. And I know this from Oxford, where last term the students had an encampment which lasted more than about 2 months. Some of the students lived in tents for all this time, and the protest continued. And the university wasn't at all sympathetic. The university was rather repressive. But I and many other academics in Oxford supported the students, and we continue to support them and the two principal demands: total disclosure of investments and divestment from any companies that are connected with the Israeli occupation. So I believe that in protest, I believe in showing solidarity with the Palestinians, and I'm particularly close to the student protesters at Oxford because students are always on the right side of history and Israel is on the wrong side of history. So I'm not hopeful of a solution of this conflict in the near future, but I am much more optimistic in the long term. Emil Habibi's famous novel was about the pessimist, and I am a pessimist. I am pessimistic in the short term, but optimistic in the long term.
Interesting. I like that word. I haven't heard it before. And you mentioned your new book, which we should.
In Arabic, it's al-mutasha'il.
Al-mutashahhid. I like that.
Optimist.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. And you mentioned one of your current projects, which the book that's coming out, which we should all get for sure. And thank you for your activism and supporting and speaking out. That takes a lot of courage and guts. Not many people have done so. And I think you probably inspire younger Jewish people in the West to hear it, because oftentimes, as a Palestinian, as an Arab, people say, oh, well, it's you talking, but it's very different hearing it from academics, historians, Jewish people. So what really drives you to continue to sort of discuss, and not only discuss, but address all these important issues and all that you do?
I'm an Arab Jew. I'm proud of my Arab heritage, and I'm equally proud of my Jewish heritage. The four core values of Judaism are altruism, truth, justice, and peace. And I look at the present Israeli government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, and it's the antithesis to these core Jewish values. The essence of Judaism is non-violence. This government is the most brutal, violent, expansionist, overtly racist government in Israel's history, and it's the first government to conduct a genocidal campaign against Palestinians. And therefore, as a Jew, I feel that I have a moral duty to speak truth to power, to continue to give interviews like this one, to continue to speak out against Zionist fascism, and to stand by the Palestinians in the hour of need. This is what drives me to continue.
Wonderful.
Amazing.
Thank you for it. If we think about 5 years from now, what is your big vision, either for yourself in your work or for Israel, Palestine, and the whole situation?
I'm 79 years old, so in 5 years' time, I may not be around anymore. But
hopefully you will be.
But I'm still firing on all 4 cylinders, and I expect to continue to write and speak about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and to contribute what I can to achieve freedom for the Palestinians. And if I may end on a personal note, I feel very strongly about this issue. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't just a scholarly interest of mine. I'm a politically engaged academic. At the heart of this conflict is injustice to the Palestinians, and therefore I feel that, as I said, that I have a moral duty to continue to struggle for justice for the Palestinians.
Yeah, and I think that moral duty and that passion you have will probably, hopefully, keep you going for many, many years, because I think when people have that mission and vision, they keep going for a long time. Professor Avi, as we wrap up, is there anything we didn't cover that you'd like to add?
We covered a lot of ground, and I'd like to end on a personal note by saying that the present situation in the Middle East could hardly be worse than it is. And yet, I do not give up hope of a better future. And my own past, my own experience as an Arab Jew living among Arabs in Iraq, in harmony, enables me to think outside the box, to think of a better future for our region based on humanity, on treating all people not just as enemies, but as human beings. So the key message that I want to convey in all my work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the same message that Edward Said conveyed so eloquently in his work, which is we must not lose sight of our humanity.
Wonderfully.
So beautifully said.
Well, on that note, maybe we leave it there and just say thank you so much to Professor Avi Shlaim for joining us today. And thank you, Professor Avi, for your eloquence, your insights, and that dedication, as you just mentioned, to justice. I think it's almost become a thing of the past to think about humanity being honorable, having integrity within, and a sense of justice and fairness. And I think it's a quality that is very underrated and needs to come back much more. So we really have appreciated you sharing all of those qualities with us, and of course your excellence in terms of your coverage of history and your own personal story. So thank you again. To say to all of our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to share it, to subscribe. Just hit the subscribe button. It all helps us with our quest for bringing these stories out to you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And stories and representation really matter. So stay informed, stay engaged, take action as per Professor Avi. And in solidarity, we'll see you next time. And just to say again, shukran, a very big thank you today to you, Professor Avi. We, the world, Palestinians, Jews, everybody needs more people like you to speak out and to be active. So thank you again. Shukran.
Thank you.